Science fiction films provide hope and inspiration to millions of moviegoers worldwide, showing an exciting vision of the future. But life often imitates art, and there are many dystopian science fiction films that show a bleak future with a horrible take on what humanity can become. So today, Scott and I are going to discuss some science fiction dystopian nightmares and the present day policies that could get us there. Thanks, Scott, for joining me again. I really appreciate it. We're going to have a lot of fun today.
Yeah, nice to be with you again, Ash. Good to be discussing something a bit less doomery this time.
I thought it would be even more doomery. We're going to talk human rights violations first.
Oh, plenty of doom, but at least we're not there yet on these ones.
So what we've gone and done is we've gone and looked at about 10 science fiction films. We've cut it down to 5, and we've ranked them on various scoring criteria, like, for example, whether they feature a totalitarian regime, whether there's human rights violations, whether they depict wealth inequality, ecological collapses, evil superintelligence, artificial intelligences, and of course surveillance state and ridiculous jobs. So starting off this repertoire of terror is the 1987 pseudo-Western sci-fi adventure film Robocop. Now in this film, we have a police officer who was set up to effectively be gunned down so that his body could be placed into a cyborg suit, which of course is a complete violation of the Geneva Convention, experimenting on live human beings. The corporation that facilitated this was largely incompetent, running a series of failed projects and initiatives, and even later on in the series got taken over by another company. The film itself was, I think, was made in 1987 and was generally around concerns about actually the beginning of neoliberal policies being rolled out around the world. And some of the concerns in the film were things like privatization, corporatization, technocracy, corporate incompetence. But it was actually quite a good film because it was about Alex Murphy sort of rediscovering his humanity or wrestling with his humanity in this cyborg suit. It's one of my favorite films, but it does warn of severe human rights violations. Vivisecting a human being and putting them in a cyborg suit is not exactly what you would consider ethical by any standard. So, Scott, what are some present-day policies or socio-political phenomena that could get us into a situation where we have technocrats violating human rights?
I mean, it all comes down to the growth mandate, doesn't it? If we're going to continue having a single mandate for corporations that they must grow, and they must grow at a larger rate than they grew last year, then they have to start cutting corners at some point in a lot of industries, perhaps not all, but in a lot of industries, it involves skirting close to the line. This is a big part of what the new world order that came out of World War II was about, putting a big bright line on the ground and saying, this is what human rights are, and there are no greater purposes in the world order than protecting human rights. As a world, we stepped away from that, like you said, during the neoliberal era, starting with Thatcher in the 80s and progressing on to Reagan. And so really, it's just the steady course, I think. What are your thoughts?
Well, I thought it's also when companies effectively become trusts. OCP, Omni Consumer Products, was essentially probably what Amazon would be if it was in the 80s. You know, they sold everything, they manufactured everything, virtually everybody in the entire city worked for OCP. It was almost like the sort of a suburban American version of the East India Company. And they had so much corporate power and so much dominance over every aspect of society that they could start pushing for, or at least cause government officials to turn a blind eye to whatever they were doing in their science laboratory.
Yeah, it sort of comes down to that question. I've had a few discussions about that this week. At what point does a large corporation become more like a government than it does a traditional private corporation? If you're getting to the point where your society's rules are set by the corporation that people work for and the corporation that provides everyone with their consumer products, at what point do they cross over from being a private corporation, in essence, into sort of a pseudo-governmental body?
Well, when they can bring a whole country or a city to its knees.
Have you ever been to Detroit?
No, I haven't. I've watched a great horror film called It Follows, which I think is set in the dilapidated outskirts of Detroit after their housing collapse and ensuing poverty. And It's about a mindless entity that sort of follows you around and kills you,
Yeah.
which is very disturbing. But no, I haven't been there. Have you been there?
Yeah. I went there 3 or 4 years ago. Fascinating place. One of the most telling things in their city construction. So the dilapidated buildings thing is obvious. That's an obvious policy failure. But the really telling thing is their public transit system. So obviously they didn't want to have anything take the place of cars, being a car city. But the one piece of public transportation infrastructure is a monorail that goes from each of the large high rises in the CBD, just above the city, on a monorail in between all of the headquarters of the car companies. Really,
Wow.
really insightful to see what those corporations thought about the rest of the city in general and what the risks were.
This also reminds me of another film, Fight Club 1999.
Mm.
The main character's job in that film was to apply the formula, which is essentially if the average cost of a lawsuit when a car malfunctions and causes death or serious injury is less than fixing it, then they let the cars just be dangerous. So could it be that maybe that's another cultural sort of narrative that's been injected into the American culture, that at one point these car companies, I think it was Fiat or something like that, Ford Pinto or something, that they had this much power and they actually violated decency by essentially applying that formula because they had
Yeah,
so much market power.
I think that's a really insightful observation that if you're a government, you have an absolute responsibility to your civilians that are under your control. If you're a corporation, your responsibility is to your shareholders under our current system. So yeah, if it's cheaper for you to have cars that blow up than it is to fix them, then you just let your cars blow up.
How you get to Robocop from now is if you have corporations that are large enough to capture the public trust. You have a profit motive or a cost minimization motive. Either's the same thing. It's just different sides of the ledger. And you have lack of regulation, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, at a certain point, the rules are whatever the corporation says the rules are. We've already sort of seen that with Amazon throughout this period. They tell the government what the rules are.
Yeah, but no. There's no big corporations that are violating human rights and vivisecting people at this point, though.
No one's got up to vivisecting.
Okay, so how safe are we there? How safe that we won't end up with that?
I mean, it's a tough call. In a lot of ways, there's a lot of corporations that are already at the size required for it. It's just a matter of whether consumers would still prefer to consume if these sorts of human rights violations become widespread. That's really the only question. At what point do you cut off your consumption?
Well, the good news is at least that these tech companies that are arguably public trusts at this point, that do have sway in politics, that do have enormous market power, at least the computer software can't come out of the computer and get you.
Not yet.
Well, that's probably a good way to segue into our next one, which is Logans Run, 1976.
So Logan's Run. Logan's Run is a little bit less well known than Robocop. It's a bit earlier. But the basic premise of Logan's Run is that there's this fantastic, glittering, futuristic society with all the trappings that you would expect of a beautiful, futuristic society. The only catch is when you hit 30 years old, you have to go to this ceremony called the carousel, and you ascend. The main characters uncover the secret that actually this society is just wiping out all of their 30-year-olds to keep a forever young leisure society that doesn't need to work and is ruled over by this omnipresent AI.
Well, I'd probably add to that the carousel ceremony, which is essentially like everybody goes into a big auditorium and there's this weird sort of 1970s sort of costumes and attire, and they float up to these sort of orbs and they're essentially incinerated by a laser gun. And that was sort of just that was it was claimed that they would be reincarnated. I think is that that's what was
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, that was the premise. The new babies that pop out, they're the reincarnated souls of these people that were removed from the society.
Now for this film, we're actually saying the concern is actually an artificial intelligence.
Mm.
And even though this film was made in the early 1970s and the depiction of the computers and the intelligence that ran the society was obviously fairly rudimentary, because even a simple thing like a graphical user interface of more than 15 characters was a bit outside of the imagination of the people that made the film. But the ASI was pulling the strings. So ASI means artificial superintelligence. So you've got different degrees of intelligence. You've got generalized intelligence, which is essentially if you're simulating a human, and you've got superintelligence, which is essentially if you're simulating more than one human or thousands of humans. So artificial superintelligence is a bit like us would be the ants, and the intelligence would be like a human intelligence relative to the ant. And the computer in this city was running everything, and all needs were provided for. So you'd assume that even though in the film you saw no one had jobs, and the jobs that people did have were simple things like law enforcement, monitoring things, operating machinery that was already constructed. So there was a plastic surgery sort of parlor where people could get their faces altered, and there was just one guy just up there to operate the machines, but the machines essentially did everything. And the danger when you have a civilization like that is that essentially you lose the ability to maintain the equipment.
Mm.
So once you have sort of everything automated and everything taken care of, and essentially people are just operating the machines and performing rudimentary tasks, if anything breaks, you know, you're stuffed. So there's actually lots of examples of like that in science fiction. So the Daleks in Doctor Who, before they could hover and all that sort of stuff, they had spacecraft, but all they could use to interact with the controls was a plunger. So you think, well, if anything breaks, the Daleks are basically stuffed. Right, and it's the same thing in some of the futurist channels on YouTube also talk about it. If you had a situation where you had a generational ship, or even you had an arcology, or you had people traveling between star systems over hundreds of years, you could even end up with a situation where the knowledge of even how to operate the ship is lost. But the danger in this film is obviously the ASI, the artificial superintelligence, essentially running amok, creating a civilization where people die at 30, and just being completely complacent to that possibility. How do we get there? How do we wind up with that kind of situation?
I think we get there if world governments decide it's a good idea to put the artificial intelligences that are being designed at the moment in control of things like logistics and all sorts of other social functions. I think we're teetering on the knife edge at the moment to sort of taking the plunge and plugging the artificial intelligences into our logistic systems already. Like we were saying, Amazon basically already operates artificial intelligence in their logistics and their resource management type programs. It doesn't take a big leap to see some governments take this plunge and purchase artificial intelligences to run some of their governmental functions. I don't think it would be very difficult to make the business case that purchasing artificial intelligence once and then giving it a crack is something that's going to be easily avoided by governments that think they're very strapped for cash at the moment.
What about as a society losing the ability to operate our technology? So what we've seen is that software is getting more sophisticated, but a lot easier to operate. The interfaces are cut down. There's less buttons. Some of the actual features of social media are the limitations. Like, for example, Twitter forcing you to constrain to 280 characters, having certain proportions of images on Instagram, you know, really cutting things down and simplifying things. So, because the software is becoming more simple, what's the risk that we could lose the ability to operate some of the more sophisticated software and the more sophisticated machinery? I mean, I know there's a whole culture around tutorials at the moment, but is there a possibility that we could lose some of the knowledge?
I think it's a definite possibility. I've come across some of the more wonky end of the tech world having these discussions and symposia over the last couple of months, listened to a few speeches on this sort of idea. We haven't really seen a black and white example of something failing, but the question has to be asked. To give you a really easy example, do you think that someone could write a program like Microsoft Windows from scratch these days? How
Not
many
now,
people?
no.
No, how many people in the world would have the ability to write Linux, to write Windows from scratch? I don't think there'd be many.
We saw sort of an example of how impossible it is to, maintain systems. I mean, Google went down, I think, 8 days ago.
Mm.
And I watched a very insightful documentary on it, or a very insightful commentary on it. And they said that part of their design philosophy was that the programmers not only write the program, but they write the monitoring systems as well. So in a situation where you've got thousands of programmers all developing their own compartmentalized solutions and then creating the monitoring facilities to monitor those programs, it would be literally impossible for one person or even a team of people to understand the whole thing. There's a very, very real possibility that already our infrastructure is so interconnected and so advanced that we're teetering on a knife's edge of losing the knowledge to maintain it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it comes down to this question that we've had in 2020. Should we still be pushing for 100% optimization, or should we be considering anti-fragility as a virtue in our social systems? I think all these things are social conversations that we've failed to have in the last couple of decades, and we've just sleptwalked into the situation that we're in now. And arguably, we're still not socially responsible enough to have these discussions out in the open. I think it's especially relevant in Australia because we have such a narrow economy based essentially entirely on the resource sector. We're seeing a lot of alarmists out there saying we should be making electric vehicles in this country, which I quite agree with, but you never see the question, can we make electric vehicles in this country? Do we have the skills still? And I think it's an open question.
You can actually see the fragility we have in Australia in social media.
Mm.
I mean, you saw there was a tweet storm. The iron ore price spiked, and that apparently was enough to rescue the economy.
Yeah,
really, with Australia, we're so fragile that house prices and the iron ore price, are governing our economic outcomes.
Yeah, pretty scary that whether or not your economy works is based on if iron ore goes up by 10% or down by 10%, isn't it?
So is Australia Logans Run? We've got everybody's young. It's a beautiful environment. Everybody's sort of, a lot of things are taken care for you, but we've got a fragile environment. Are we in Logans Run?
Yeah. Why not?
Yeah.
May as well be.
Yeah, but we don't have the funky music and the.
No. I'd want some better decor if we're having to put up with Logan's Run. I think
Logan's Run also featured teleportation. It did. So you've got this 1970s sort of vision of the future with automation and artificial intelligence and post-scarcity civilization where everything's manufactured, and completely out of place was that apparently there was this part of the culture was that everybody sleeps with each other. And the way they do that is they actually teleport directly into people's bedrooms. So I'm like, well, I know we've got Tinder or whatever it is. And, they invent teleportation, and the application of that is promiscuity. I mean, I thought that was pretty funny, a funny little quirk of the film.
Yeah, absolutely. It begs the question, how far are we away from VR getting to the point where you can just tap into someone else's bedroom whenever you want?
Well, I think if anyone went back in time and said, we're going to have an app that shows you people and you swipe left or right with your finger to decide whether you want to contact them for the purposes of dating, people would be like, well, you've got the ability to, it's like, imagine explaining that to someone in the 80s. Like, imagine explaining to someone in the 80s where they've got a phone the size of a brick and they're using it to conduct, important business transactions, and they feel really privileged that they're able to talk to people on the phone from anywhere in the country. And then you explain to them, oh, well, in 30 years' time, we're going to have a device that is smaller than this, it fits in your pocket. It can show you live videos, and it can also show you people, and you swipe left or right whether you want to get in contact with them. And the first thing they'd say was, what a ridiculous usage of that technology. I mean, what a shame. I mean, think of all the other things you can do, and we do all those other things as well. But I just thought it was funny because it's similar to inventing teleportation and using it for the dating circuit of whatever city in Logans Run.
Yeah, absolutely. We have the grand total of all accumulated human knowledge in our pockets at all time, and the main thing we use it for is hooking up with people and ordering hamburgers.
Yeah, well, it is what it is. Basic human needs, though. It's serving basic human needs.
At the end of the day, it's hierarchy of needs stuff, isn't it?
That's right, and that gets back to Logan's Run, because that city basically just served people's needs.
Yeah.
So we are in Logan's Run. I think that is not, obviously people aren't getting incinerated at 30, but
can't be far off.
Can't be far. Maybe it's a different age. Maybe it'll be. Oh, there's actually a film that's quite nasty that we're going to get to that does actually happen.
What's next, Ash?
Okay, the next film we have on our list of doom is Blade Runner, the 1982 version, not the recent 2017 version, because the 2017 version was more artistic, more about the art, whereas the original 1982 version was more about the themes at the time. And the characteristic of that film was massive wealth inequality and underclass. So in Blade Runner, there are a race of artificially engineered people called replicants, and they are effectively, and this is a common theme in sci-fi, including even Battlestar Galactica and a lot of other sci-fi films where we do have replicated humans, is that they're thought of in the movie as machines, or they're presented in the movie as machines, but they still have organs, eyes, they're made of biological matter. And they are superior in most ways. So it's depicted in the film that they're physically stronger. Whether they're more intelligent, that's not really touched upon in the film, but you could probably assume that they could be. They're unable to breed, but they are able to rebel. And because of that, there's an elite police unit that is tasked with the horrible, ethically dubious profession of essentially killing their own kind, which would do someone's head in. Now, in the original film, in the 1982 film, it's the main character, Harrison Ford's character, the protagonist. He is, in some versions of the film, thought of as a replicant. In some versions, he's not. I think the consensus is that he is, because in Blade Runner 2049, it was revealed that he is. He is in a dystopian version of Los Angeles, where you have massive wealth inequality. So you have arcologies, which are essentially gigantic skyscrapers where the wealthy elite live, and you have a lower street level, presumably that's further down from the higher structures, which is, multicultural. It's there's people everywhere. There's bazaars and black markets, and it's really dirty. And you can really see the wealth inequality in that civilization. And even in the 2049 version, it's also depicted that you're flying over this city and there's just houses everywhere. It's almost like what's the name of that city in Hong Kong, Kowloon City, or it's some city where everybody was just piled on top of each other.
Yeah, and I thought you were going to say the western suburbs of Sydney.
Oh, western suburbs they're still in freestanding houses, so. So they're doing okay for now, but we're not. But yeah, I think the inspiration of that is probably Hong Kong or some of the mega cities in China. But you have the wealth inequality where you have the working class presumably renting all of these tiny little units that are dark and dingy to live in, and you have, of course, the wealthy elites living in large apartments with the luxury of even having a pet. And that you get massive wealth inequality. So what gets us to Blade Runner? What gets us to human rights violations, wealth inequality, having an underclass? This was also a film we're going to talk about, Ecological Collapse, but there's a better one for that.
So this one's really interesting to me because we're starting to see the really early stages of these sorts of policies. Basically, the way that you get to a Blade Runner sort of society is by having economic segregation. So if you've got one class of your society that is allowed access to credit, is allowed access to the legitimate economy, is allowed to be an economic participant, and then another class that is expelled from that system for whatever reason, then, they don't just disappear. They don't just die as soon as they're economically excluded. They have to find a way to continue to eat and live. And that's inevitably participation in some form of the black market. We're seeing the really early stages of this in things like sex work. There's a bit of a campaign at the moment to start removing sex workers from platforms like Instagram, which is fairly innocuous. That's not going to be the point of no return. But if you start having very serious crackdowns of economic participation of people like sex workers, and it starts extending to lots of other classes of workers for various reasons. I mean, we could argue that there's a sort of segmentation of the economy in Australia between those that are waged and working within the taxation system and those that are getting paid under the table or working in gig work that's much less regulated. And those two systems start diverging. I think that's when you start to get one part of the city that's working outside of the system in a situation where they're not privileged, and then another part that's privileged enough to be able to continue to have legitimate economic participation.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because the sex workers aren't the only profession that's being segregated by the technocracy. So we're not talking about the governments here. We're talking about the technocrats doing it. It's also a lot of political commentators. So on this platform, a lot of political commentators have been shadow banned.
Yeah.
They're being demonetized. Some of the more extreme commentators have been kicked off, and they relied upon this type of platform for income. And they've been pushed off this platform, and they're going in droves to others. In fact, I showed a screenshot this week where you had essentially a whole bunch of channels on here that see the writing on the wall, see that they're going to get kicked off of this ecosystem, and they're concentrating into another place.
Yeah, and it's all well and good to say we shouldn't be giving money to Alex Jones on YouTube. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to say, but the issue comes when you slowly accept the economic segregation of more and more parts of your society. I don't think we're at the point of no return yet, but we're certainly not having an intelligent conversation about it.
What do you think's next? So we've got right-wing commentators and sex workers. What's next, in your opinion?
I think it's going to be taxation.
Taxation? How do you mean?
I think that's the wedge that we're going to have. We're seeing a lot of, particularly in Australia, we're seeing a lot of rumblings of gearing up to go after tax avoiders. There's been a few very interesting pieces on our major news networks. One in particular went after Peter Schiff, who you're probably aware of, is a big gold guy, runs a bank in a tax haven. He got a very serious hit piece against him. So I think that if we get to the point where the government in Australia or broadly worldwide decides that taxation is the wedge they want to draw, I think it's pretty easy to see a lot of people that haven't been paying tax, things like gig workers and stuff.
But they're already outside of the normal economy. I mean, if they're doing activities where they're not paying tax, they're already in a black economy, right?
They are, but what happens if the major banks refuse to accept their payments?
So this is the whole debanking idea.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what's the difference between the taxation, going after people avoiding tax, and debanking? What's the delineation between the two? Because they're obviously related, I think.
Yeah, I think they're obviously related. I think at the moment it's just a delineation of how far governments want to push this policy. We're seeing a lot of debanking of the sorts of people that it's fairly easy to say, yeah, that's legitimate and they'll be fine. Things like high-level tax avoidance, things like terrorism. But if it gets to the point where we're randomly debanking the whole cohort of Uber drivers, for example, if we suddenly say no, actually, you guys haven't been paying tax, and therefore the penalty is we're going to debank all the drivers. I think we very rapidly get to a point where we've got a large underclass that has no means of legitimate economic participation. And that's really terrifying to me.
It sounds like essentially you have the main economy where participating in that is more efficient and more profitable for people because it's larger. You have a network effect. That's the reason why this video on YouTube is probably going to get a couple of hundred views. And if I put it on the other one, it's probably going to get 20 views, right? So you've got 10x participation on this platform. And the economy or the platform you're on or where you're participating isn't just a physical economy, like a real economy. It's also something like a social media platform. And in the real economy, you can get damaged or get access taken away by a bank debanking you, or you can be an international participant and the government will go after you because of tax. And another example is that on a platform, so if you're a commentator, you get kicked off, you lose access to the network effect there. So essentially so there's many ways you lose access to the broader economy. And so what I think you're saying is that if there's anything that causes someone to lose access to the broader economy or the largest area, the largest marketplace, then you get huge wealth inequality, you get black markets, you get a divide growing between the rich and the poor. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's easy to say, well, perhaps it's a good idea to debank terrorists. That's not a particularly difficult argument to make. The issue is when you get to large scale debanking of undesirables within your society, it creates a whole lot of friction in your economic drivers and really limits the types of things you can do within an economy to exchange value. And at the end of the day, this is something that we've known since Adam Smith's work on free markets. The more friction you put in your economy, the less productive it can be.
So what friction was in Blade Runner? What were the friction points there?
Yeah, I can't recall anything specifically. It strikes me as something that's not looking back, but something that's happened in the past that has caused this giant rift between the legitimate economic participants and the illegitimate ones. I would suspect, just from extrapolation from where we are now, that it would be something along the lines of a gigantic amount of debt piling up, and that debt having no mechanism to be paid or released.
So just to clarify to the audience, we're just hypothesizing what current policies and positions could get us to these outcomes. I don't think that Ridley Scott really knew anything about macroeconomics and debt, because back in the 80s, they didn't have the sort of problems we're having now. But I think that another thing, it's interesting you say the friction. In the Blade Runner film, it depicts an ecological collapse. And I think when you have an ecological collapse, you have scarcity of resources. Resources need to be allocated by an authoritarian regime. That authoritarian regime grows. You get distortions in the market. I mean, one of the things that people bought off the black market in I think the Blade Runner film was, artificial intelligence toys, animals, things, artificial eyes, things like that. So there, I think that's the scarcity of resources, I think, is another thing that causes that sort of divide.
Yeah, absolutely. And the interesting thing with scarcity of resources is that when the money itself is the thing that's scarce, so arguably the situation that we're in now, and definitely the situation that we were in the 1930s, where the money itself is the scarce asset. There's not enough money around because everyone is too indebted to continue to exchange at the levels that they were in previous decades. It's very difficult to tell the difference between the money itself being scarce and the resources being scarce. I think we're definitely limited by resources in some manner, but I think it's very difficult to make an argument that we can't afford to feed everyone, for example.
On the money and debt aspect of it, things like asset ownership's priced at the margin, and we've had parabolic increases in asset prices, and as a result, the economic opportunity for one generation is a lot less than previous, even though we've got all this amazing dating apps. Well, they don't have teleportation yet, so that's a bit of a problem. But yeah, so that's another example of a class divide. So you have
absolutely.
The poor millennial or Generation Z artisan that's battling it out to find a 1-bedroom apartment, 45 square meter apartment to live in. And you've got, the people 10 years earlier that have a freestanding house in the suburbs because, that we've had obviously the issues around that. So the monetary system also can create the Blade Runner 2049.
Yeah, it very well
situation.
could. Very well could. And if you're living in a society where your house earns more income than you do,
But that is our society, right?
That is. So it's that should be a pretty scary warning sign, I think.
Cool. Okay, so the next film we have on our list of doom and gloom is
Soylent Green, right?
Good memory. Soylent Green.
So Soylent Green, the Charlton Heston classic. If you haven't watched it, don't watch it. I'm about to spoil the end. Turns out Soylent Green is people.
Oh man! Oh God! Oh man! Oh God! Oh man! Oh God! Oh man! Oh God! Oh man!
So they've got this broken down society. They're running out of food. The ecology is completely collapsed, and they need to figure out a way to feed people. And all of a sudden, this miraculous new food starts rolling off the production line. It's little green biscuits, really protein dense, solves all of their hunger problems. What a miracle. And then in the end, turns out they're just grinding up people and feeding them to everyone.
The society that's depicted in Soylent Green is essentially New York City, but with a population of, I don't know, tens of millions of people. And everybody's sleeping in stairwells. You have a fairly incompetent police force that's sort of cracking down on people for minor infractions. You have brownouts, lack of water, lack of food. And if any congregation starts rioting too hard, they bring in the scoops, which are effectively just large bulldozers, but with a scoop at the front to scoop people up and shove them in the back and take them off somewhere. Nothing suspicious about that. And the humane way that they let people die is they wheel people into a room where they show them beautiful vistas of the countryside and nature as they pass away. And then they're wheeled into a factory where it looks like they're actually processing chemicals, but they're dissolved and made into these green biscuits. There's also red biscuits as well. And then the film, it's also described that they're extracting it from the sea somehow.
Yeah, magical food technology.
That's right. So, but the issue in that film was an ecological and farming collapse. So it also sort of reminds me of The Matrix as well. They ran out of power, so they have to farm humans. In Soylent Green, they ran out of food, so they have to eat humans. How do we get to cannibalism? How do we get to an ecological collapse?
The historical question, how do we get to cannibalism? It's always the last resort, isn't it? We get to the ecological collapse by pretty simply, if this climate change stuff is as serious as we think it might be, and our farmland ends up stopping yielding food at some point, or reduces the yield significantly, if we can't figure out how to do sustainable farming at this sort of population level, I think it pretty naturally gets to this collapse.
We don't even need the climate change issue. Over farming will do it.
Oh, absolutely. And that was the issue in the 1930s with the Dust Bowl in America. They just farmed the hell out of the land and they couldn't take it anymore. Just saying, you're right. It doesn't even really take a huge calamity to occur. You can run out of food as soon as your farms stop working properly.
Some of my following on Twitter are actually preppers. Well, I think a lot of them are very positive. I mean, they're into greenery, they're into nature, they're into horticulture, and they're planting seeds and things like that. But they're very concerned that even this pandemic could have caused a supply chain disruption, which could have caused issues with the food supply.
Yeah, we're already seeing pretty serious food inflation in America. So is that just because they're printing too many dollars, or is that a symptom of food chain disruption. It's kind of hard to tell.
Well, I think in the American situation, it just depends who you ask. I mean, the people on the sort of the more libertarian side would argue that the fact that the food distribution problem in America is because there's too much socialism. There's too big a safety net. So because there was too big a safety net, people didn't mediate their behaviour. So now they're dependent on these food stamps for food. And then the people on the other side of the aisle would say, no, that they need that anyway because we've got all this already existing inequality and we need to tax the rich to redistribute it to the poor. So I don't know what side's right. Probably both have elements of the truth, but we do have there is a situation over there right now where a lot of their population is dependent on the government to eat.
It's sort of interesting, these libertarian arguments that say that there's too much socialism and that's what's causing the problem, when we're seeing that the United States and the UK are the two countries that are having food stress in the developed world at the moment. And they're the two ones that have the least rigorous social safety nets out there.
Judging the amount of socialism in your society and what's right, it's a bit like trying to hit something on the wall that's the size of a needlehead with a basketball. You're going to throw the basketball at the wall, and you're going to either have too much or too little, and you're never going to actually get it right. And not only that, but the needle's moving. So it's constantly, I mean, Shaquille O'Neal could probably hit it, but I don't think our politicians could. So
No. And luckily you don't have to dial it exactly right, the level of socialism that you have in a country. You just need to make sure you've got enough socialism that everyone keeps eating while you have enough food supply.
Well, there's a couple of people on Twitter that just are adamant that you just basically just give the poor money.
Yeah.
Well, if you do that, if you create money and you give it to the poor, I mean, you are effectively debasing everybody else's purchasing power. And but even Reserve Bank targeting inflation is debasing people's purchasing power. It's effectively stealing. I mean, dropping rates just distributes money from people that don't own assets to people that do. I mean, we're already doing that now. So would it really hurt to give it to the hungry people? Probably not, in my opinion.
I think it's pretty telling that we only ever hear the argument that the currency is being debased when it comes to making sure that poor people are fed.
Could you expand on unpack that point? That's an interesting.
Oh, sure.
one.
I mean, you've never heard any politician stand up and say we can't bail out these oil companies because it will debase the currency and endanger everyone else's asset price and make the currency worth less. I've never heard that in any economic argument other than we should give money to poor people to make sure that they can feed themselves and house themselves. It's the only context I've ever heard the anti-debasement argument made.
What about the right wingers would come at that and they would say, well, if you give people money, they become dependent on it, and when they become dependent on it, they don't act to change their lot in life, and then then once that gets ingrained in an entire generation, and then once a generation's born underneath that, then you end up with almost a semi-permanent problem that's very hard to fix.
I think it's an error of construction. Yes, that is a real issue, and it's a real thing that governments should be concerned about. But I don't think it automatically leads to the argument that you shouldn't make sure that everyone is fed because they will become dependent on the government. I think the correct argument to make in that circumstance is you should feed the poor first, but you should have an industrial policy that allows your economy to get back to a point where the private sector is employing people to do something useful for the society in order to be fed. It's obvious that you can't indefinitely feed your entire population from the government coffers, but we've seen it demonstrated in Britain, where they just refuse to run appropriate industrial policy for decades. People can't make their own industrial policy. That's not how societies function. There needs to be something assisted by the government, at least to point a sign to say, we want this industry in our country and we're going to support it. And whoever wants to run this industry, come and do it here and employ our people to do it.
So the way you get to Soylent Green and possibly cannibalism, although it did look like the cannibalism was being facilitated by quasi-private public companies, is you don't feed the poor, you debase your currency, you over-farm, and there's the climate change thing as well.
Yeah, essentially. And I think that it's, I mean, I don't really like to say it's possible from the current settings, because I don't like to consider cannibalism and recycled protein as our major food source as an actual reality that we might get to. But you know, that introduction that you ran through, blackouts, lack of farming fertility, an authoritarian government rounding people up and putting them somewhere, a magical new food technology that allows you to create protein sources out of nothing, that starts sounding a lot like a few of the things that are going on at the moment.
Like what?
I mean, I don't want to say it, but have a look at which countries have had blackouts in the last couple of months. Have a look at which countries don't seem to readily have enough food to feed their people. Look at which countries are rounding up groups of citizens based on whatever arbitrary characteristic they have and segregating them from the rest of the society. I mean, those are the baseline policies that let you justify to yourself that perhaps recycled human protein is a suitable food source.
Well, that's probably the most terrifying thing I've heard this year. And we've had a pandemic, so thanks God, I'm going to sleep well tonight. Well, so let's move on to something a little bit more lighthearted.
Yeah, let's do the fun ones.
Yeah, we'll do a fun one. So let's do Idiocracy. So Idiocracy is a film set in the present day where it is depicted that couples that have higher IQs or intelligence quotients are participating more in the workforce, and they're more aware of the economy, and they're more aware of their own lot. So they're doing things like delaying having kids. Although I think there's other reasons why people are doing that in Australia specifically, but smart people aren't breeding basically. Whereas it's depicted where people of lower socioeconomic status are not thinking as much about their future, or not thinking as much about their future possibilities and the responsibility of having kids. And those people are associated in the film with having a lower level of intelligence, and they're having more kids. So fast forward 500 years, you get an economy full of people just sitting on their couch drinking Gatorade. And a guy with average intelligence, who was an everyman, participated in a government experiment to see if you can cryogenically freeze people. And of course, the machine malfunctioned. And instead of freezing him for a couple of years or a couple of months, freezes him for 500 years. And so he awakens into a city where they're taping together buildings with duct tape. Nothing works. Everything's broken. The interfaces for all the computers look like a child's toy. And it's really a sad state of affairs. And the American president is a wrestler who fires machine guns at his rallies.
That's what I thought.
They think that fertilizing their crops with an energy drink will make them grow, and they're not. It's killing them. But the most interesting aspect of the film was it's similar to Logans Run, where you have a bunch of 20 and 30-year-olds trying to operate sophisticated machinery. You have in this dystopia, this messy, dirty city where everybody's just having fun the whole time and treating life like it's a joke. You have a whole range of bullshit jobs. You have security guards at prisons that are so dumb you can actually tell them you should be leaving the prison, and they'll put you in the queue to leave. You have a doctor that basically does nothing apart from waving a device on you to tell you if you're sick or what disease you have. So you have basically people employed effectively to do nothing. So what gets us to Idiocracy from where we are now?
I mean, similar to a lot of the other things that we've been discussing, it's lack of industrial policy, lack of the need to have workers to provide the goods and services that are required in the society, and getting to a place where, as a society, you can't have the honest discussion about how much work do we need to do, what work should be done, and what work really we don't actually need. Do we still need to be working 40 hours a week, or should we be cutting people's work time down and providing them with economic participation based on a lower number of hours? If you can't get your society to a place where you can have that honest discussion, then your society continues to be structured in the way that our society is structured now, where you have to work 40 hours a week, and those that are doing less well, they have to work several jobs, adding up to 50, 60 hours a week in a lot of cases. If you can't recognize that, perhaps it's time to take the foot off the accelerator on the everyone works all the time idea that we've had for the last 50 years or so, then you end up with a situation where the economy has to create jobs for people to justify their ability to consume. And that just perpetuates and perpetuates. Like we saw in the film, 500 years, you end up with everyone working on stuff that doesn't really produce much. The machines do all the production, but you have to work within this mold in order to justify your ability to consume and continue to exist.
Well, I think in the depiction of the film, I think people would be too dumb to operate anything. I mean, if you go to McDonald's, the menu system in the ordering area is not straightforward. I mean, the user operated one is, but the thing behind the counter, I mean, there's buttons everywhere. Someone of below average intelligence, I don't know if they could operate that. It's pretty complicated stuff.
No, and they certainly couldn't design it either.
No. And in Idiocracy, I think the other thing is that people were just, it was almost like children pretending to be employed.
Yes.
You have like the kids that pretend to be mechanics and they go, or pretend to be cooks and they just get Play-Doh and mush it up and there you go. That's fake cookies, but I've imaginative play. It's almost like you had people in our age who were just thinking they had a job when they didn't, and they were too dumb to understand otherwise. And that was the IQ effect that was having that. Well, that was the depiction of it in the film anyway. But for us to get to that situation, this comes back to the whole UBI versus job guarantee versus MMT versus universal basic income. It's this idea that because we've got all of this deflationary technology, that maybe we don't need to have this idea that people work 40 hours. Is that what you're getting at? And if you get that, if you retain that idea that people need to work 40 hours, and you retain that idea that all these jobs need to exist when they don't really need to exist, and therefore you get a situation where people are just waving technology around and pretending it's doing something. Is that what you're getting at with that one?
Yeah, exactly. And if we can't, as a society, get to the point where we have a very honest and open discussion at high levels of government and with the people involved as to whether or not we should do a UBI or a job guarantee, if we can't have that conversation openly, then we're just stuck forever in this policy of everyone works all the time, and that's what you have to do in order to eat. So we have to create private sector jobs for everyone, regardless of whether we need them or not.
In Australia, we did have very low unemployment. How is it possible that an economy could actually have so few unemployed, but yet have such a concentrated economy? How did we get unemployment so low in the first place?
We hired everyone to be each other's servants, basically. We had a gigantic, sprawling retail sector. I know that we've had collapsing small retail, but I don't think Bunnings is collapsing anytime soon. We had this gigantic service sector. You can hire someone to do basically anything that you don't want to do. So we can run that sort of an economy for a while, and it will keep the money flowing around. But at some point, you probably want to start producing something rather than just having people work in shops and cutting hair and pulling beers as the underpinnings of your economy.
Well, that's interesting, because that gets back to the whole Georgism thing and the rent-seeking idea, and that such a huge proportion of the economy is clipping the ticket. It's like having an economy that where you go to a restaurant and 90% of the people there are actually waiters.
Yeah.
So we actually already have bullshit jobs already. It's just that they're difficult to do. I mean, it's not straightforward in some of the sectors that I'm talking about, and I won't name them. But you already have the presence of that in this country. It's just that it's over the top of already the rent-seeking idea.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you extrapolate that forward, if we keep this idea that if the rent-seeking stays, if the idea of the 50-hour week stays. I mean, I work 50-hour weeks all the time. It's not a big deal, but if everybody has to do that, then that's how you get an idiocracy type situation where you just basically have people just sitting around doing very little and achieving very little, but we're being very busy.
Yeah, absolutely. And at a certain point, there's a serious question about if that is the best way to structure your society, if we do actually want the amount of employment stress floating around in the society that we currently have, or if it might be better to try and have a look at some other systems. The risk is that if you don't incentivize work strongly enough, then you do run out of reasons to do productive things for other people in the economy, the classic free market conceptualization. But arguably, we're so far beyond that very pure Ayn Rand, Adam Smith conceptualization of the free market that, perhaps we should have a serious discussion about what the next century looks like so far as work.
So which crowd are you in? Are you in the MMT, the JG, or the UBI crowd? Which one do you sit in?
I just argue with all of them, to be honest.
Okay.
I've read a great deal of all of the literature on all of them. I honestly can't tell which one of them works out the best. They all look like they've got some pretty serious second order consequences to me. My favorite, so far as the MMT thing goes, that's clearly a way of financing a government. I don't think there's any serious economist that's saying MMT is just untrue. It seems obviously true once you look under the hood. The issue is what you do with that MMT unlocks and how you actually manage to drive your currency without the safety net of government bonds being the limiting factor on how much money you put out.
So the final film is Brazil, a British absurdist 1980s dystopian future, which is the spiritual successor to the film 1984, which depicts a totalitarian bureaucracy, but an incompetent totalitarian bureaucracy. So Scott, do you want to introduce the film and maybe tell us how we get there?
Yeah, sure. So this is one of Terry Gilliam's fantastic series of films in this sort of dystopic sci-fi range. He was ex-Monty Python, and the film came out of those early Thatcher years where the government was sort of seizing up and stopping functioning properly. So in the film, we've got these gigantic bureaucracies running a highly technicalized, a highly tech-inspired, computerized system to ostensibly make their government much more functional and much better and much more efficient. But the workers in the departments are unfamiliar with the system to the extent that the system doesn't function. It depicts this concept of, if we can only install enough computerized systems, then the government will work perfectly, and the inherent fallacy in that. So you've got this society where there's this gigantic bureaucracy ruling over the world, but it is so caught up in its regulations and its systems that it doesn't really work properly, and the regular people have to find ways around the government in order to get the things done that they need to get done.
Well, that's right. So in the film, the main protagonist's apartment has an air conditioning system, and one of the most prominent features of the film were these ducts everywhere, and pipes, all over the ceiling, just everywhere, and presumably because there's some sort of central heating system that sort of runs the whole city. And the protagonist's air conditioning system breaks, and he ends up, his apartment gets really, really hot, and it's quite bad. And he calls the Department of Central Services to get it fixed. And because and he says in the recorded message, it's an emergency, come and fix my heating. And of course the recorded message says we're only open between these particular 2 hours. And the thing that gets him really into trouble with this mechanical bureaucracy is that there's this vigilante air conditioner repairman played by, I think it's Robert De Niro. And he comes to the apartment and fixes the air conditioning system. And then the central services listens to the message, and then they send their own repairman out who come and try and fix what this other guy fixed. And they find out that Robert De Niro's fixed the air conditioning system with some device that is different to how they'd fix it. So they know that he's been stuffing with the works. And they end up, dobbing him in, and he uses the bureaucracy against him. Like he says, "Oh, you have to fill out Form 66W to come back into my apartment." And it's just this mechanical bureaucracy. So what other things get us to a mechanical bureaucracy in our society?
So that the film is poking fun at the idea of the Soviet model of centralized government being all powerful and controlling all systems and making sure that you can't get a loaf of bread without authorization from the central government. It's really taking that concept of the Soviet model and pushing it into the absurd. The scary thing for me is that I think that we're starting to head towards and take the first little steps towards that idea, with the concept that if you inject enough tech into your government systems, of course they'll run perfectly fine and everything will be good, ignoring the inherent problem with governing a society with a one-size-fits-all technological machine. I think if we allow, particularly in Australia, if the public allows our government to continue to push off responsibility for delivering the services that they traditionally deliver onto private, either private contractors providing them with the systems that they need, or private corporations in their entirety, I think we start getting to the point where we've got a centralized government, but it doesn't really have a lot of responsibility for the services that it's trying to deliver. I think that's the wedge that gets us there. This government desire to get rid of all the responsibility that they have to their citizens by saying, "Oh, we've got an algorithm, and the algorithm told you that you're not allowed to do this or that. It's not us, it's the algorithm."
Well, that's the MinGov and libertarian types and the free market types would say that purpose of privatizing everything and getting government out of it is to remove exactly that. I mean, I can't remember what it was you that told me, but there's job for life. There's governments can end up having politicians that are in positions purely because they want power, and because they just want power, they don't focus on making things better or more efficient, and therefore you can get that kind of bureaucracy there as well. When you get everybody, this is something I see in corporate Australia, when there's a blame culture, or when there's a culture of no responsibility, everybody's doing everything they can to protect themselves. What about those sort of aspects?
Yeah, I think they definitely lead us to the position that we're in now and push us more into a Brazil type absurdist world where no one's responsible for anything, and you can't blame anyone because the entire system is constructed to obfuscate blame. We're starting to take the first few steps in this. It's very difficult to pin the blame of government failure or government dereliction of responsibility, or even just appeal a simple government decision is very, very difficult. And if you've got a gigantic government that seems to exist only to perpetuate its own bureaucracy, then I think that's how you start taking the steps down this path.
Okay, so of the films, Robocop, Logans Run, Blade Runner, Soylent Green, Idiocracy, or Brazil, where do you think we're headed? What's the most likely outcome?
So I think for Australia, we're most likely going to end up in the Brazil situation. We've got this long-lasting tradition of both having a severe distrust for the government, but expecting the government to fix every problem as it arises. I think that's really deeply ingrained in the Australian culture. And I think it's going to get harder and harder and harder for the government to deliver the services expected of it without opening itself up to too much blame and requiring too good working conditions for the bureaucrats and all those sorts of things. So it seems like it pretty naturally falls into the situation where you've got this all-powerful government that theoretically can do anything that it wants, but can't figure out how to do anything.
Well, Australia's a weird country because we've got the right-wing party is in power, but they've done the biggest spending in history. They've been the biggest socialist, we call it the biggest redistributionist government in history. The left-wing party was privatising things. The country is generally left-wing, so we've got a single-payer healthcare system, we've got big social safety nets, we've got cheaper education, although that's probably going to change. Australia's just a basket case, of left and right.
I think any other developed country that looks at our politics just instantly gets confused. I mean, the biggest example of that is that our right-wing party are called the Liberals. You say you're a liberal to any other country on earth, and they think that you're a left-winger that wants, human rights and various other stuff. But over here, it's the right-wing party that, I mean, I'm sure it probably started off with being about liberal markets, but I haven't seen any evidence that they're at all interested in having liberal markets in this country anymore.
I mean, someone joking on Twitter said the other day that their housing policy is more extreme than a socialist country. I mean, you had the amount of redistribution there is insane.
Yeah.
And it's really, Australia's a bizarre country. Like, to try and explain that our Liberal Party is the right-wing party to anyone else in the world, they'd be like, what?
Yeah, it's bizarre. And we simultaneously have some of the biggest government departments in the whole world, including some of the sort of social democratic countries in Europe, but also a very intransigent bureaucracy that doesn't seem to be interested in keeping up with the times or adapting to change or looking at its regulations and policies. It seems to just be satisfied to defend the bureaucracy and add extra regulation on top of extra regulation as it goes. It's a bizarre politic that we have here. And you mix it in with the general opinion of the average Australian that says, I don't want to know who the Prime Minister is. I just want them to not bother me and to let me do my job.
So any final words that you'd like to?
Look, on so far as where we go and how we get there next, I think that all of these films give us an interesting insight into what might happen in various countries. Some of the really terrifying ones, I mean, particularly Soylent Green, I unfortunately think that might be a reality before too long in a couple of countries. But I think it's really important to remember that these authors and these filmmakers write science fiction as a warning. I'd highly encourage everyone to go and reread all of George Orwell's work, for example. He doesn't just talk about the Soviets. He talks about all sorts of things from colonialism to surveillance capitalism, because these authors and these filmmakers give us the warnings of what to look out for and how bad things can get if we're not vigilant and if we don't stand up for the politics that we want our children to grow up in.
So, Scott, thank you. And in the same way that George Orwell was prophetic in warning us of the dangers of surveillance capitalism, you've warned us that we could end up heading down a Brazil direction. I personally think we're more Blade Runner 2049, but that's me. Anyway, Scott, thank you very much for your time today and have a lovely evening.
Thanks very much, Ash.